Welcome to this course on rigging a first-person weapon. In the last couple courses in this series, we looked at modeling weapons and texturing weapons, so now it's time to make them move. I want to show you the result before we get started so that you can see what we're aiming for. We have a pretty simple rig here with bones for all of the different pieces that are movable. So of course we have a handle bone here that controls everything from the movement and rotation of all of the pieces. We also have a bone for the trigger and one for the magazine that you can eject and put back in. We also have a slider here to actually eject the magazine. We've got a safety little switch over here, a little rotator, and we also have a rotator over here to eject some extra bullets or the empty cartridges as they're fired. Now we also have this bone up here which does quite a lot of things, and if we move this forward you can see that it actually transforms the gun from a battle rifle to a sniper. So this is going to be a pretty in-depth rig. It's actually not too hard to set up, but if you can rig this, then you'll be able to rig just about any weapon that you can possibly think of. Let's go ahead and just get started with our default blend file, or actually the blend file that I have provided in the download section of this course, which just has the gun to start out with. So you can see that it's all one object. If we toggle X-ray here, which, by the way, I'm going to be using that a lot, I realized as I practiced for this, but if you open up your preferences and turn on extra shading pie menu items under key map, then you'll get that X-ray toggle here at the bottom, and I'm going to be doing that pretty much constantly. But you can see all of the pieces are here tucked away, and we're going to go ahead and just get started rigging. So in this first video, I want to rig just 2 or 3 basic pieces to show you the process, and then after that, in the next video, I'll go ahead and rig the rest of them, or at least create the bones for the rest of them. So let's hit Shift A and add a new armature. We can hit Control and click it in the outliner here, and I'll call this Rifle Armature. Then I want to keep the scale at 111. You can see if we pop open the sidebar by pressing N, the dimensions, or the scale, is 111. If I move this, it's going to mess with that. But since the rifle is scale 111, it's already applied, then we want to tab into edit mode before we do any of our transformations. So once we have that, then we can grab the top of this and pull this down to better match the handle, because that's what this bone is going to become. And it would be really helpful to have some gizmos to work with, but I also really like this box selection that happens with the box select tool. So I'm going to go to the gizmos here and turn on move and rotate. That way, when I go ahead and select the top here, I can use the gizmos like so. Let's move this bone into place right along this handle here. I also have snapping set to vertex here, such that when I grab a piece, I can hold Control and just snap it to one of those vertices of the gun. Let's go ahead and switch to the bone tab in the properties panel. That way we can also hide the end panel, the sidebar, and let's call this bone root. You can also call it handle, but root is a good name for anything that all of the rest of the bones are going to be controlled by. So with that, I'm going to also look at the roll as I'm placing these bones, and if you're not aware of what that is, it rotates the bone along its main axis, but it also changes where all of the different axes are pointing. So if we switch from global to normal here, then you can see that the axes jumped and the Y is pointing up, the X is pointing forward, and as I go ahead and roll this around, it looks like I have to select it again to actually have that update. That's interesting. But if I do that, it should update for you real time. Now you can see that the X is pointing off in that direction, and we can change which direction it will rotate. So this is really important because a lot of these we want to have rotate along the x-axis with this control here. So we want to make sure that that x-axis is pointing in the right direction. Now for this, we're going to be moving it all around and rotating it all around, so it's not going to be a huge deal. But we want to be aware of that roll and make sure that it's not pointing slightly off for whatever reason, so that we can easily animate it later. So with the roll set to 0, let's hit Shift D, rotate this 90 degrees negative, such that this is moving in the positive Y direction. And let's scale this down and place it right by the trigger here, and we can call it trigger. The roll here is set to 180, and that is totally fine. We could set it to 0, but it won't make too much difference here because it's only going to be moving in that Y direction. Now let's hit Shift D and make another bone. This one is going to be for the magazine, so let's call it magazine. And rotate this 90 degrees in the negative direction, such that it's pointing downwards. And the reason that we're doing it this way is so that when we're in pose mode, I'll hit Control Tab and go over to pose mode. You can see that it rotates here from the top, so that it's easy to guide this into place as we're shoving it back in during the animation. Alt G and Alt R just to put that back in place. If this was the other way around like this, it'd be a lot harder to try to get it exactly in the right spot with the rotation at the bottom. Alt G, Alt R, put that back, and I'll keep it straight up and down, just like the handle over there. So this one, the roll, I'm going to set back to 0. So you can see the X is pointing to the right, and Y is pointing down. Now let's make another bone here for the ejection slider. So let's hit Shift D on this trigger, move that over. And one thing to note, that should happen automatically for you, but if it doesn't, just be careful. I have the 3D cursor here right at the center, but if for some reason it moved, we want all of these bones to be directly along this Y-axis or 0 along the X-axis. So you can see that the head and tail of all of these bones is 0 on that X-axis. And so we want to make sure that it's directly in the center of the gun and not off to the side. So this one, let's call it magazine eject. And here I'm going to set the roll to 180 to keep things consistent, because so far all of the different rolls have the X pointing to the left if we're facing this way. So I just want to make sure that things are about as consistent as possible. And then with this, I'm going to parent all of these to the main root bone. Control P, making sure that the root is selected last, and hit Keep Offset so that they don't jump and attach to the bone. And now if we go to pose mode, we can grab just this and move all of the others around. So this is working quite well. Then we could go ahead and parent the gun to the armature here, but when we do that, it's going to create all of our vertex groups for us that are going to be how we control which parts of the gun are applied to which bones. So we may as well just make all of the bones first and then parent the gun to it, and then go ahead and assign things all at the end. So while we can't see any of the parts moving right off the bat, that will be very, very easy to do later, right at the end, once all of the bones have been created. So that's all of the basics, and in the next video, let's go ahead and make all of the rest of these bones. In this video, I'm going to create all of the rest of the bones that we need to rig this weapon. So I'm not going to be doing the constraints or any of that quite yet, but just placing the bones and maybe some simple parenting. First up, I'm going to do the rifle barrel, and there are two parts to that, as you saw in the last video. So I'm going to take the trigger bone here, though it could be any bone, it just happens to be oriented in the right direction. And in edit mode, let's switch over and hit Shift D and duplicate that up. This one I'm going to place at the back of the rifle of that second barrel, or the barrel near the back, and I'm going to rename the bone barrel.001. And the reason I'm naming it this way is because we're going to have multiple parts to the barrel. I'll make this just a little bit bigger, but it doesn't really matter too much. But then I can hit Shift D, move this along the Y-axis, and snap this one to the front part of the barrel. Let's see, if we look at this in X-ray view, we've got to zoom in a little bit, but then we can see that the end of that is right around here. Snap that along the Y. And I'll bring this down along the Z-axis, or both of them down, just so that they're centered, but since we're only moving them along the Y and not rotating, it doesn't really matter. But you can see that this is now automatically called barrel.002, which is handy. And then I'm going to parent it to barrel.001 by shift selecting the original barrel bone, Control P, and keep offset. And so now in pose mode, that's going to follow along. Now after that, we have the sights up here that slide down as the scope pops out, so as to not block the sight. And to make that, we just need 3 bones, one that goes straight up, one that comes down here, and one that slides along. So as we pull the slider out, then instead of stretching the bone as would normally happen, what it's going to do is keep this length the same and have this bone, the original one, rotate downwards like that as to flatten the whole thing out. So let's take this rifle bone here, Shift D, rotate this 90 degrees and scale it down. Let's set the roll to 0, and I may as well do that for these bones as well. And before we duplicate this or extrude it, let's rename this. I'm going to call it ironsights.001. And I'm going to snap it right to the center of this by grabbing this along the y-axis. I'll hit it again to go on the global y-axis and snap to the middle. And then G, Z, Z again, and snap to that middle vertex. So it's right in the center of that point of rotation. And then I'll go into wireframe view so that I can actually see this circle here and snap that up to that point of rotation. So it's right about there. And then once we have that, we can hit E to extrude, pull this down to this cylinder, right down there, put that in the middle, and then extrude this along the global y-axis. Okay, so then eventually, once we do all the constraints and stuff, when we pull this forward, instead of stretching the bone, it's going to make this guy rotate downwards. But they're already named properly, rolls are good to go. We do need another bone here on the side that kind of like locks this into place. That was just kind of an extraneous detail that I added while modeling, but it does need to be rigged if you want to use it. I don't think it's too important here. But let's go ahead and take this last bone and let's Shift D to duplicate it, rotate it around like so. Actually, in order to get the rotation exactly the same as this one, what we can do is duplicate this bone instead, immediately left click and just scale it down, and then rotate it 180 degrees. And it looks like that kind of messed with the roll, so we're going to have to fix the roll anyway. Or we could just set that to 0. So pull this out along the X, and then down, right into the center of rotation for this guy here. Right about there. Pull this in just a little bit. There we go. Let's go to pose mode really quick, and you see as we rotate this, it'll just pull that guy out, and if we pull it along, right now it's local Z, but it looks like it's all lined up, so that's good. But we do want everything to rotate along its local X if possible, just for ease of use. So let's go to X-ray view and change the roll to 90 degrees. There we go, now it's rotating along its X, that is perfect. And we will leave that as is. Okay, so more movable pieces. We have the sights in the back here. I'll start out with the trigger, Shift D, rotate that 180 degrees. Somehow that made it 181. There we go. And line this up with the point of rotation. So just parallel with this face that moves along that way, and then right in the middle of this curve there. I'll take this and pull this out. like so, and I will just call this sights, or actually let's call it rear sights to be clear. And again, this is not being rotated along its x-axis, so let's set the roll to 0. And there we go. Next to that, we have the safety. That needs to be rotated at kind of an odd angle. So let's take this bone, Shift D, and what I'm going to do just to make this a little bit faster is rotate it kind of by eyeball. Actually, we do need it this way, like that. But then I'm going to snap it. So I'm going to take the base of this and snap it to that vertex there, which we need it to rotate around the middle of this circle, but this is going to be the kind of the closest point to that. And then once we get everything lined up, then we can pull it in closer towards that center of the circle. But this just gives us a place that's right in the middle when it comes to going along that direction. Then I'll take the head of the bone, snap it to the middle at the bottom there. And so now it's in the right place, but it needs to be rolled into the right position. So let's set that to 0. And then just rotate it to be parallel with the geometry there. Okay, so that works. And it is rotating along the X direction, so that works out pretty well. Then let's take the base of the bone, pull that in along its local Y until it's at the center of this circle, right like so. And let's just make sure it's still lined up precisely, and that looks good. You can pull it out along its local X if you want to, just that it's not stuck to the bottom. But we just need the rotation, and that's looking good. Okay, then I will call this bone safety. And let's move on to this back mechanism. So there are a few pieces here, and the first one is just the slider that you pull that kind of engages the whole mechanism. So let's make that first. Again, I'll just take the trigger, since it's rotated in the right direction, Shift D, move this up. And let's find that it's this dot over here. Scale this down. I'll set the roll to 0. And pull this out along its local x-axis here. I'll call this scope transform. And in the example that I showed you, I had a bone here at the top that kind of did everything at once, that moved the slider here, that moved the hinge, that moved all of this at once. But I realize now that that was kind of a useless bone in the sense that I could have just used this slider as that control. So that's what I'm going to do going forward now. So it's just the exact same effect, but one less bone. Now there are a few different things going on inside of this scope. Let me go into edit mode for the rifle just to show you. So I'll go to object mode, select the rifle, tab into edit mode, and then I'll just hide some of these pieces here. Box select those guys, Control L to select everything that's connected to them, H to hide. Alright, so we're going to need a bone for this hinge here, and that's going to connect to a bone for the scope. Then we have a secondary hinge for the cover, just to move that slightly up. And apologize for the super squiggly lines, but I was just drawing them quickly with a mouse. And then this little base here, or the little floor that's at the moment kind of sticking through the scope, we can change that, but that's going to move the entire thing upwards. And then we have this slider that moves back and forth. So this is going to be the main part of it that moves everything up and down. This is going to be parented to that, moving everything back and forth. Then the hinge is going to be parented to that to flip the scope upwards. And then the scope cover is going to need to pop up just a little bit extra. So that's why I have this flap here, moving that forward so that it's not blocking the eyepiece right at the back. So a few bones there, but not too complicated. And then of course we need to animate the flaps themselves, which are these guys over here. And that's where roll really comes into play. So So let's go back to our rifle armature. I'll select that in the outliner, hit tab to go into edit mode, toggle X-ray so that we can see things, and let's get to work. So first we need the bone to move everything up and down. So I'll hit Shift D, rotate this 90 degrees, and I'll just snap this to the bottom of that floor there. Pull this down so it goes up to about there. And I'll call this bone Scope Lift. Then I'm going to hit Shift D, rotate this 90 degrees along the negative direction. Pull this out. The size and location of this is somewhat arbitrary. I can place it just right in the middle there. And this one I'm going to call, instead of Scope Lift, it's going to be Scope Slide, because it slides everything back and forth. And this one, let's delete the roll there. That was 360, so that's about the same as 0. I'll delete the roll there as well. And then I'm going to take this bone, Shift D, and duplicate it, rotate it around to make this hinge. So we want to make sure that this is, the base is right around the center of rotation. And I can use kind of the sides here to judge whether it's in the center or not. As long as there's equal spacing on both sides, kind of where the bone overlaps with the geometry. Let's place this in the center here. Maybe that's a little bit easier in wireframe view. Oh, there's actually a little circle in wireframe view. That makes it easier. I can just line that straight up, and there we go. So the roll is set to 0, and that looks good. Okay, so once we have that, this is going to be the scope underscore hinge. Then I'll take the head of the bone, extrude that along the global y-axis, and pull that forward quite a bit. And this is going to be the main part of the scope. So I'll delete the hinge.001 part of this and just call it scope. Then after that we need the cover hinge. So let's take the scope hinge, duplicate this up, rotate it, scale it down, and just place the center points, or the head and the tail, at the main parts of rotation here. Alright, there we go. And then we need to rename this. I'll call this scope cover hinge. Set the roll to 0. And then take the head, extrude that along the y-axis, pull that forward, and that will do the trick. So this kind of pops the whole cover forward so that it's not blocking the eyepiece, so that you can put your eye right to it instead of kind of smashing your head against the cover. And then with that done, I think we have all the bones except the flaps. Let me double check real quick, and it looks like we do. So let's go ahead and make those flaps. Should be pretty simple. First, let's take this lift here, Shift D, rotate that 180 degrees, and I'm going to call this scope cover flap .001. The naming, the automatic naming thing doesn't work if you use underscores. It only works if you use .001, so that's why I'm doing that. And then place the base of this right along that center of rotation here. There are no vertices to snap it to in this case, but I'm going to try to eyeball it. I'll snap that down. Set the roll to 0. That way it's being rotated along the X direction, and it needs to be in the middle here. So for that we can just set the head to 0 in the X direction, and the tail to 0 in the X direction. That way it's directly in the center. So now let's take this, and I'm going to parent this right away just to the scope cover. Let's take this bone, parent it to that one, Control P, and keep offset. That way as I duplicate this, I don't have to reparent all of them. And now might be a good time just to parent this whole system. So if we go back down the hierarchy, this is already automatically parented to the scope cover hinge. And this is not part of the hinge, it's just the scope cover. So let me rename that really quick. So it's already connected to the scope cover hinge, so we don't need to parent that. But the hinge should be parented to the scope. So let's shift select the scope, Control P, and keep offset. Then the scope is already connected to the scope hinge, so no need to parent that. And then the hinge, instead of being parented to the root, should be parented to the slider, so that the slider can move it back and forth. And then the slider needs to move up and down with the lift. So let's select the scope lift with Shift, Control P, and keep offset. All right. So I think we have that whole system down. You can Control Tab, go into pose mode if you want to try it out. Make sure you select the lift. That brings everything up and down. Move that along the X and Y. Rotate this, and it all seems to work. Okay, so then let's go back to edit mode and make the rest of these flaps. And this is where the roll becomes really important because they're actually rotating at kind of weird directions. So let's take the flap number 1, Shift D, rotate this 90 degrees. And first I'm going to make this top one, so that's the easiest. Pull this along the X and just kind of snap this and place the point of rotation right in the center there. I'll set the roll to 0 and pull the head out along the Y-axis. Snap that over. But the main thing is just that this piece is directly in the center of this. And if we really want to get super exact, which I don't think we need to do, but if you want to, you can. I'll do it for just this one, just to show you. But what we can do is, let's go to not X-ray. Let's select the rifle in object mode, tab to go into edit mode, and then I'm going to take this face here, which you can see is a full circle. And I'm also going to take this face. You can see if I hit Shift S, then I can do cursor to selected to place the 3D cursor right at the center there. And since that's directly in the middle of everything, then I can just snap the base of that bone to the 3D cursor. So let's tab back into object mode, select our armature, tab into edit mode, select the base of the bone. Actually, we can just select the whole bone, Shift S, and selection to cursor, just like that, and it'll jump it over just a little. And it looks like the head, it's not quite 0 along the X, so I may as well just pull that back. So the geometry itself was slightly in the wrong place. But everything else, at least along the local Y and Z, will be exactly in the center there. And actually, I might want to do that for the others as well, but I think eyeballing it should work. But if you find anything being a little bit off, you can always do that. Okay, so we have that, and it's being rotated along its X direction, which is good. Let's take that, Shift D to duplicate it, and let's bring this up along its local Z to the very center, this guy here, just like so. And let's go 7 to go to top view, move this along its X-axis, hold Shift to go in smaller increments just so I can be very exact. Bring this right to the center, like so. And it looks like we're done, but we're not. Again, we have to be very careful around the rotation because we want this to rotate along its local X-axis, just to make it easy so we can rotate all of these in the same way. So let's set the roll to 90 degrees, like so. That way when we rotate it around the X, it'll flip outwards. And right now, let's see, the Z is facing up on this top one. So let's have the Z always be pointing outwards. So instead of 90, we can do -90. That way we can keep that consistent. Then let's take this bone, Shift D, duplicate it up here. And again, we need to take this roll, and with the Z facing outwards, line this up. We can kind of zoom in and see whether these axes line up with the line of the actual cover. It looks like -52 is about right. Yep, that looks good. We just need to make sure that it actually lines up with this geometry here. And another trick that you can do is if you want to go to object mode again, well, actually we could probably just do it on this bone without having to jump into the other object geometry, is if you hold shift and use your number pad, you can go to like the normal or local orientation of front and side view. So instead of it being like global front or global side view, it can be local, which is really nice. So that way I can take this and see, is it exactly in the center? Yep, that's fine. Maybe a little bit more along the local X, like so. And that's way easier than trying to kind of adjust it here. It's just easier to eyeball that way. Then I'll hit Shift 3. So you can see in local side view here, it's not quite lined up. It needs to be shifted just slightly. So let's try -53. Shift 3, and that's even farther in the wrong direction. So -51, Shift 3, and that looks like it lines right up. And then we can just grab this along its local Z till it's right in the center there. And now we have everything perfectly lined up, and it's consistent with the ones that are rotated in different directions. Then, since we already have our 3D cursor placed right at the center here, if it's not, then you'll want to definitely place your 3D cursor in the center, or at least 0 along the global x-axis, because we're going to mirror these guys. So let's go to the pivot point up here, change that to 3D cursor, and then take those two bones on the side, Shift D, and then Control M, X and X. So the global x-axis, Control M for mirror. So now these are rotated in the right direction, or sort of, they're at least in the right place. But you'll notice that the rotation is a little bit off, or the roll at least. So let's select this bone here. It is rotating along the x-axis, but the Z is pointing inwards instead of outwards. So this needs to be 90 degrees. Okay, this one we need to rotate in that direction. Okay, so the X is parallel and the Z is pointing outwards. Again, this one was -51. So let's try +51 to be exactly opposite, and that's looking good. And there we go. Let me just do a quick once over to make sure I didn't miss any bones. But that should be all that we need. And they should be all parented correctly to each other. We can even turn off the rifle or hide it from the viewport. Make sure everything's parented correctly, and it looks like it is. So we've made all of the bones, and in the next video we're going to bind them to the actual mesh pieces of the object, and that way we can move things around, and that'll be super fun to see and just kind of mess with. In this video, we're going to attach the mesh of the gun to each of the bones. So let's head to object mode, and very easily we can select the gun mesh, gun object, and then just select the rifle armature, hit Control P, and that will just bring up some automatic armature parenting options. So let's choose armature deform with empty groups. And so what that's going to do is, first, if we look at the rifle object itself, go over to modifiers, we now have an armature modifier already applied with all of the settings that we need. Also, I'm going to just turn off this triangulate modifier because we don't really need it. But you'll also notice in the object data panel that we now have all of these different vertex groups that correspond with the names of the bones. And the way that you connect the parts of the mesh to each of the bones is just create a vertex group with the same name and assign parts of the geometry to it. So this should be very simple. All we need to do is go into edit mode on the rifle object itself and go through each of these and assign different parts of the mesh to it. So for example, we're going to do the root last, so let's skip that for now. Let's look at the trigger. I can just select one face on the trigger here, hit Control L, and we need to set the delimit to regular or material, just so that it wraps around the whole thing. It's not cut off at the seams. Then we just need to assign that to the trigger itself. And then to make this process a little easier, I'm going to hit H and hide this. Now I'm also going to hide the armature because we don't need to see it for now. I'll also go into X-ray view here so we can check what we're seeing. Then we can go to the magazine, box select down there, Control L, assign, and hide. Then we have the magazine eject. Make sure we get both sides of this. Control L and assign. Now if you want to double check what's assigned to something and you want to see it visually without having to select and deselect things, then you can go to the overlays here, check vertex group weights, and that way you can see whatever's assigned to the group that you have selected is going to be displayed as red. Everything else is going to be displayed as blue. So let's leave that on for now. We can hit H to hide the eject. Then we can go to the barrel, select the back part of it, Control L, assign, then hide. Same thing for this front part, barrel.002, assign and hide. Iron sights 01. This one we need to make sure we have all of the different pieces that are associated with it. And I just hit period on the number pad to zoom right to the face that I had selected, by the way. So we need all of these different pieces. And I'm going to turn off my gizmos here because I don't need them in the way at the moment. Control L and assign that, hide, move down, and in this case we need to select all of these parts, Control L, but we also need these pieces here, and this point of rotation, Control L. There we go, and remember this piece has its own separate bone. Let's assign that and hide. .003, that's this bottom part right here, which encompasses both of these pieces. Assign and hide. And .004 is this last piece right up here. Assign and hide. Okay, then we got the rear sights here in the back. Box select this top part and any extra little details that we have connected to it. Shift box select, Control L, and we can just hit G and move things around just to make sure there's no other little details hiding anywhere. Assign and hide. Let's go for the safety. Control L, assign, hide. Scope transform. That's going to be this slider here. Assign that, hide it. Scope lift. These are going to be a little bit harder because it's inside these different pieces. So what I'm going to do is actually just take this body here, or lots of pieces of this body. Nothing else needs to be rigged at the moment. So I'm just going to hide that so that we can see underneath. That just makes it easier to select things. So for the scope lift, let's take one of these faces here, Control L, and assign that. Hide. Scope slide is this box down here. Control L, assign, hide. Scope hinge. Just need to make sure that we get both sides here. And for some reason it's not selecting very easily for me. Maybe because there's no face there. There we go. Control L and assign. Scope itself has a few different pieces to it. So we can select some, Control L, but then we also need these parts right there. And let's also grab the bottom part of the hinge right there, Control L. And I think that's all of it. Of course, we can always assign and remove things later if we need to. Scope cover hinge, that's going to be these pieces here, Control L. Scope cover, it's going to be both the top part of the scope and the little pieces on top, Control L. Assign and hide. And then flap 1, remember we started on the back one here, so all of these things, three pieces, assign and hide. 002, what we can do to actually just make sure that we have everything just right is let's hit tab to go into object mode and select this armature here. And we can expand this if we want to see the rifle below it. But if we select the armature, then we can go to viewport display and turn on names. And that way we can see exactly what we're assigning to. Okay, so let's select the rifle again and again go back into edit mode. So when we grab 002, we know the name of the bone matches what we have selected over in the vertex groups. All right, so we need to select the flap here. Select both of those, assign and hide. 003 is down here. In this case, I can just box select. Did I assign that? No, I did not. Okay, that would be helpful. All right, now for number 4, assign and hide. Control L for number 6, so we're kind of jumping down one. Assign, hide, and number 5, Control L, assign, and hide. So you can flip those names if you wanted to, if you wanted to keep things kind of going around in that direction, but it's kind of already jumping over a little bit from the top to the side and whatever, so I'm not going to worry about it too much, as we're just going to animate them all at the same time anyway. But with that, we have everything now assigned to all of the bones that we've created so far. Let's hit Alt-H, bring that back. And what I'm going to do is now assign everything else to the root. Everything that's not already assigned to something else. Because, you know, this piece over here is not assigned to anything. So if we go to object mode and select our armature here. Oh, for some reason it's unselectable. But let's go to pose mode here. So you can see all of these things are now properly assigned as they should be, and parented correctly and all that good stuff. However, if we move the root, you can see it'll move all those individual pieces, but not what's actually, not the main part of the gun. So everything that's not already assigned to a bone needs to be assigned to the root. So let's go back to the rifle here. Let's go to object mode, select the rifle, tab into edit mode, and what I'm going to do is just take all of these. I wish I hadn't hidden that large piece. It helped us view it, but it also, when we clicked unhide, it was selected, and I could have easily based the selection off of the inverse of that, but oh well. Now I'm just going to take all these different pieces and just hit select, and then I believe I can use the arrow keys here just to go between each of these and move down, select, move down, select, move down, select, so on and so forth until we've selected all of our different pieces that have already been assigned. Okay, so we have all of our already constrained or already grouped vertices. Then I'm going to hit Control I to select the inverse of that, select the root, and then click Assign. And there we go. So now if we go to Object Mode and head over to our armature, Control Tab to go into Pose Mode. Now when we move the root around, then we are all set. We can move each of these individual pieces, and everything should follow as it should. So here we go. We have everything all technically rigged. It's all set up. I can turn off the names here in the armature properties. But now what I'm going to do in the next part is constrain the movement of the bones and add some constraints and things like that to make the movement of them a little bit more intuitive. In this video, I'm going to add some bone constraints to get everything ready for animation. Because you'll notice that we have a few different issues with the rig so far. For example, when we pop the scope up, everything just goes straight into the gun. And we need this to stay facing forwards. So that's a pretty quick, simple example of bone constraints. So what we're going to do is go to the Bone Constraints tab, which is different than the actual constraints. So this would be for the armature as a whole, but we need to go down to Bone Constraints. And we also need to be in pose mode to find that tab there. So with that, Let's constrain a few of these. And the first one is the example that I just showed, is we want this bone to always stay facing forwards. Now, this is a little bit more tricky than it might at first appear. Not too hard, but also I did it wrong the first time that I did it, in that I thought, oh, I'll just make it always face forward. But the problem is that we're going to be parenting this root bone to the player's hand, and that can be rotated in any direction. So if it's rotated, like that, we can't have the scope facing that way. That would just be silly. So instead of actually like locking the rotation of it, what we need to do is make it copy the rotation of a bone that's already facing in the right direction. So in this case, we could use the scope, or we could use this guy right here, the scope transform, and we need to copy that rotation to this bone itself. So let's select the scope and then go to the bone constraints, and in there, let's do a copy rotation, and you'll notice that the bone turns a little bit green to show that it has a constraint applied to it. Then let's use the rifle armature, and for the bone, let's use the scope transform. And since we're not going to be rotating this bone, and it's parented to the root, then it should always be set. We definitely want to use world space here, and X, Y, and Z, and it should just work right out of the box. So let's try this. Let's rotate the root bone just randomly to face in a different direction. And when we go ahead and rotate this bone, hey, there we go. It pops the scope right up. So that's perfect. But one thing that you'll also notice is that these bones can be rotated in any which way. And of course, if we had our gizmo here, we could make sure that it rotates only on the X by clicking and dragging that. But it's kind of hard to always do that. So what I'm also going to do as I add some of these different constraints is lock the transforms of some of these. So we could either do that with constraints, or we could simply pop open the sidebar with the hotkey N and change the rotation mode, as well as lock some of the angles of rotation and location. So this one, for example, really shouldn't move at all. Its movement is determined by the slider, so I can lock all of these locations, so it doesn't even show up in the gizmo at all. In fact, if I hit G, it will actually start to rotate, which is interesting. But I also want it to only rotate along that x-axis. So I'm going to change the rotation mode from quaternion, WXYZ, because if I do that, you'll notice as I rotate along the x-axis, two values change, and that just makes it really hard to manipulate in the graph editor because you're changing two different graphs for one apparent value. So let's change this from quaternions to simply XYZ Euler, and then lock the Y and the Z. That way it's only able to rotate along the X. So even if I'm just rotated in the viewport at this odd angle, and I hit R to rotate, you can see that it's only going to rotate in that correct direction. So any of these main bones that we're going to be doing that with, I should set to only rotate along the Euler axis. Now for a bone like this that can be rotated any which way, I'm going to leave that at its default quaternion. For things like this, if you'd like, you can just lock rotation altogether and only allow it to move along the y-axis. Similarly with this little slider here, that moves back and forth. Again, it should not rotate at all, and it should only move along its local y-axis. So you could do that for all of the bones, but I'm not going to worry about it too much, I'll just keep that in mind as I'm animating. But if you're handing this off to another person who may not necessarily know exactly how it should be used, then that would be a good thing to do for all of the bones. But especially the ones that we're going to fine tune. So for example, these guys right here that are rotated at kind of odd angles, that would be very helpful to do because it just makes it a lot easier. So let's try to do this for all of these bones at once. I'm not sure if this version of 2.8 will work with this, but let's give it a shot, where we select all of these different bones, and then I'm going to hold Alt to change all of them, and switch from quaternion while I'm still holding Alt to XYZ Euler, and let's lock all the locations, and let's lock every rotation but X. And if I select one, you can see that it only now rotates along the X-axis. Good. Similarly here, only rotates along the X-axis. Perfect. All right, and just for now, I'm going to go and turn off X-ray here at the top. All right, so we can see the bones, but we can also see the mesh a little bit more clearly. And now we can just hit R and rotate this without it going in any weird direction, and we don't have to worry about it being accidentally moved to a different location. But any of these that we need to rotate, we definitely need to switch from quaternion to XYZ Euler. So for example, that one. What else rotates? This guy rotates down here, the hinge. So let's lock that location, switch to XYZ Euler, and lock the Y and the Z. Let's see, we already did it for that one, and none of the rest of these rotate except for this guy here. Lock the Y and the Z, lock the location. This bone here also needs to rotate along its x-axis, XYZ Euler, and lock everything else. You could also lock the scale, but I'm just not really going to worry about it as I don't plan on animating that. Okay, I believe we have, oh, I missed one, the safety right down here. Again, rotating along its X Euler, and you can see exactly why changing the roll to only go along the X is very helpful here. The next constraint that I want to add is an IK constraint for this slider up here, because I want to be able to pull this out along the Y, and right now I can't because it's actually parented to this guy. But in effect, what I want to happen is as this moves out, this rotates down and stretches to meet it. So what I'm going to do is use an IK constraint for this bone that's going to then track the head of this bone to the base of that bone, and this one will be forced to rotate to meet that point wherever these two are connected. So inverse kinematics is another discussion for, if you haven't tried it out at all, definitely check out our Fundamentals of Rigging course, and that will give you an introduction to what an IK is. So if that's confusing to you, jump back there and watch through that and then come back. But this is just a extremely simple IK, so it will be, shouldn't be too hard. But one thing that we do need to do is separate this bone out from this parent, because right now you can see if I hit G, I can't actually move it at all. So let's go to our bone tab here, and we can't actually remove the parent here up in pose mode, so let's hit tab to go to edit mode and just remove the parent. So you can see that we can move it around, but it's no longer connected. So control tab, go back to pose mode here, and now I can move it independently. But remember that it's also now not parented to stuff, such that as if I move the root bone, it's not moving around. So let's take that and take the root, control P, and let's see, I maybe have to do that in edit mode. Select that, select root, control P, and keep offset. Tab back to pose mode, and there we go. Okay, so we can move this independently, and now we just need this guy to move with it. So let's go to the Bone Constraints tab and add an Inverse Kinematics constraint right there, and let's choose the rifle armature as the target, and the bone that we want to point to is this iron sights.003, and we can also just type that in, iron sights.003 right there. And whoa, there we go. So you can see that it is working, but the chain is way too long because it's trying to get the root, which is the parent of this iron sights, to follow it as well. So that's just way too confusing. So what we're going to do is limit the chain. So we only want 2 bones to follow it. So instead of a chain length of 0, which is infinite, if we just use 1, you can see that it'll only do that top bone there. But we also want it to do that bone behind it, so let's increase the chain length to 2. And then as we move this along the y-axis, 8, there we go. It works great. But we also need to make sure that this bone here, instead of being parented to that bone, as I think I just duplicated that one and it inherited the parenting, or duplicated the parenting along with it, let's tab into edit mode, grab that bone, and then the larger one that's next to it, control P and keep offset. Go back to pose mode. Let's try moving this along the y-axis, G and Y, and there we go. Perfect. So we just want it to not move farther than that, and we can just eyeball that when animating. I guess you could always limit location, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. However, I will lock the rotation of that bone and the location for everything except the y-axis so that I can just hit G and smoothly go through there without having to worry about it going off into any other weird directions. The last bone constraint I want to add is for the scope cover, because just how we wanted the scope to follow that, we want it to always face forwards in relation to the gun. We need to do the same thing here, because as we rotate this, you can see that the scope cover is following that. So we just need to add a constraint to copy the rotation, just like we did before. So let's go to add a bone constraint, copy rotation, target rifle armature, and let's use the transform again, scope transform, world space, X, Y, Z, we're all good. And now as we rotate this, you can see that it pops it up and over. Perfect. So in case you just moved any of your bones around, that's totally fine. Just select everything. Alt-R to clear rotation. Alt-G to clear any location movement. And here we're all set to start animating. All right, now we get to do the fun part of actually animating the transformation of the weapon. And this is going to be pretty straightforward. All we need to do is select everything, all of the bones here, and on frame 1, I'm going to hit I and insert a keyframe for location, rotation, and scale. Now this is going to add quite a few keyframes. If we drag up our timeline here, to hit this little arrow here, to bring up this source list, you can see we've keyframed every single object, and in that we've keyframed quite a few different properties. So it created a bit of a mess. However, we're only going to keep the keyframes that we use and delete everything else later. So this just enables us to make sure that everything is being set. And then we can hit the automatic keyframing button here, or just the record button, and then move to the end of the animation, which in this case I'm going to set to frame 15. There we go. So it's only going to be 15 frames long. We don't want it to be too long, otherwise it'll annoy the player with how long it's taking, because this is, again, going to be in-game and players are going to be switching back and forth. So it's only going to take 15 frames, and on the last frame, I'm going to move everything into position to where it needs to be. So for example, I'm going to take this back part of the barrel and just move this forward. You can pull it all the way out until it's way too far, and then just kind of push it back until it looks like it's right in place. Then we can take this guy and do the same thing. And the bone makes it a little bit hard to see exactly what's going on where, so you can also temporarily disable overlays. If you have the extra shading pie menus, just hit Z, drag up, and you can still move everything just without the bones in the way. So on frame 15, we're going to move everything into place. So I moved the barrels, now I'm going to move the iron sights, just drag this forward until right before it pops. But we don't want it to actually pop, just right before it does that. Then I'll open up this guy. Has that little like secondary locking mechanism. Then we have the rear sights in the back here that rotate, and this becomes like a little stand. So this pops up, and then the scope comes and sits on it. So I'll try to make sure that that's a level surface. And then the biggest thing here is that we take the actual scope hinge and just rotate this up, like so. And then we can take the floor and pull this up. So again, it's sunk pretty low into this object here, into the back of the weapon. But we can pull this up like so. And then move the slider forward. And maybe rotate this a little bit more so that it comes back down. And then I'm going to have it rest right below, or right behind this little ridge there. So we do need to rotate this a little bit more, and then maybe pull it back just ever so slightly. There we go. Now the cover here is flipped over the eyepiece, so we wouldn't be able to put our eyes against it. So let's rotate this up, just like that. And this is still kind of covering it. It'd be very uncomfortable to look through. So I'm going to take this hinge and do the same thing where we just rotate this up and over. And we can go into X-ray view or wireframe view to make sure that we're not accidentally like clipping anything. We can go to about there, where it's like resting on top of the part of the scope that's the tallest. And then we can open up all of these flaps as well. I'm just going to click and drag and box select them. And let's see if we can do all of these at once by hitting R. It does not look like they're going in the right direction. But let's try to change the transform orientation to local. And since these are all constrained to only rotate along the x-axis, or their local x-axis, I can hit R, and also didn't seem to work. But for some reason, if I use the gizmo, then it does work. And there we go. So let's see if we can make them lie flat right on the surface there. We can disable gizmos to make sure that it looks right. And that looks pretty cool. Okay, this one seems to be like clipping through. So let's select that, pull it up, right about there. Okay, and I think those are all of the pieces that need to move in order for the transformation to work. We do need to move this little slider here, but that's what's going to drive the rest of the animation, so I'm not going to keyframe it here. So now what's left to do is adjust the timing and the spacing of everything, because we have the basic transformation, and that looks pretty cool, and it looks pretty good. Let's turn off overlays there, and that's looking pretty decent. However, I think that there's a lot more that we could do to just kind of fine-tune this and make it look even better. So now I'm going to switch from the timeline to the dope sheet so that we can get a little bit better control here. And also we can uncheck selected so that we can see all of the different keyframes that we're working with. And you'll notice that we have quite a few bones here that don't have any animation data to them. And we don't really need to see that in the dope sheet. So I'm going to select everything by hitting A while hovering over the summary here, or just the source list. And then I can go to Key and Clean Channels. And that will remove all of the channels for bones that don't have keyframes. Then I can also select all of my keyframes here and go to Key and Clean Keyframes. And you'll see that all of the ones that have remained constant are now deleted. And then if I clean channels again, then it will remove all of the other channels as well. So you can see that under a lot of these, we're only changing the Y location, X Euler rotation, all that stuff. So that as we go through and fine tune this, we're not changing way more keyframes than we need to. You can see only the X rotation here is what's keyframed. Now you will notice that if we take one of these and we expand it, and then we make a rotation or something here, then it'll go through and keyframe all of those things again. And we don't want that. We want it to only keyframe the available ones, or ones that are already keyframed, in this case just the X Euler rotation. So if we go to Edit and Preferences, under Animation, we can check Only Insert Needed and Only Insert Available under Auto Keyframes and Keyframes. That way, when we make a change here, instead of inserting all of those keyframes, you'll see that it's only doing it just for that X rotation, because that's the only thing that has been previously keyframed and is available for further changes. So now to fine tune this, all we need to do is go through and adjust the beginning and end of these different keyframes and decide when we want things to start and when we want things to stop. The first thing that I'm going to look at is the rifle barrel, because while I like how the scope pops out immediately, I don't think we should have everything starting all at once. So I'm going to delay some of these, and the first one I'm going to delay is this back rifle barrel here, and I'm going to make it not start until frame 5. So let's go to frame 5, take barrel.001, and drag the keyframe over. So it delays a little bit and then pops out. It also has the effect of it being a little bit faster now because the keyframes are closer together. I'll also take the front part of the barrel and move that out as well, though instead of on frame 5, I'll take that even farther and put it on frame 10. So if we look more closely at this, instead of it all just kind of coming out at once and feeling very even and the same, one pops out and then the other. so it feels a little bit more layered and interesting. Now if we want to see the effect a little bit better, I'm going to increase the preview range here. I'll just go to the timeline and increase this to maybe 25, just so that we can see it sit for a little bit before it transforms. And now that we're actually doing some animation that requires more than just the timeline, I'm going to switch over to an animation workspace so that we can keep things pretty clean, and we can always pop back over to the layout workspace if we need to. And here we have a dope sheet, and we also have an action editor, which we don't need both of these at the moment. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of the dope sheet over there, and we can work only in the action editor. So this is essentially the same thing, however it's only for one action at a time and for one object at a time. But since we're only working with one armature, it's not going to make too much of a difference. However, I will rename the action that we're working with here. It's just default called rifle armature action, and instead I'm going to call it rifle_transform. I'll also click the little shield icon to save it, make sure that it doesn't go away if it's not applied to anything, which shouldn't happen. But for anything that you're going to be using later, it's always a good idea to click that little save fake user. And then I'm going to go ahead and continue tweaking these keyframes to give this a little more layered appeal, just so that things don't happen all at once. For example, the sights moving at the top looks kind of like a little inchworm. I think that should happen a little bit faster and also be a little bit more delayed. So I'll take that bone, and when I select it, it'll highlight this in the action editor so I can clearly see which keyframe it is. And I'll pull that over to frame 5 as well. And I don't think it should end at the same time either, and it could still use to be a little bit faster. So let's see, let's take that keyframe and pull it in. I'll put that at about frame 10 too. That feels a little bit more snappy and punchy. For the locking mechanism up here, I'll move that to match as well to 5 and 10. Let's just see how that looks. I think that works well. Now in this animation workspace, I'd really like to have that playhead where I can just press the buttons and play it. That way I can also play it backwards and things like that. So I'm going to split the window here, drag on the corner and pull up, and just switch this to the timeline, but drag it back down like so that I'm only seeing the header here. That way I can quickly use these buttons and change the preview range and all that stuff, as well as play it backwards. Next up in the list, we have our rear sights, and I think that this looks good jumping into action right away. But one problem that you might notice if you look closely is that it's intersecting with the scope itself. So this is more of a technical issue rather than a stylistic one, where we can't have it clip through quite like that. So we need it to be a little bit faster. So I'm going to have it end on frame 12 instead, because I like the speed of it already. There we go. But we just can't have it intersect. Next we have the scope lift. And I think this should pop up a little bit sooner as well, just so that the scope can come all the way up as soon as possible and then look like it's coming back down, so that it can make a nice arc. So it already kind of is making a good arc, but if we just bring this up a little bit faster, I think it will come back down a little bit more, or appear to come back down when it rotates back downwards. So let's try 10 and see if that pops it up too fast. I think that works pretty well. Let's leave that at 10. Next we have the slide. And I think this should start a little bit later, because you can see as it's coming forward, the scope itself is actually hitting the back end of the rifle there. So let's take the scope slide, the first keyframe, and drag that back. Let's start it at frame 5 for now. We can adjust it later. You can see now it has enough clearance to move past that. That works pretty well, but it comes to a kind of sudden stop. Everything comes to a sudden stop. So what I'd like to do is actually take the scope slide and end that sooner as well, such that the rotation can kind of be a little bit of overlap. So it'll still be moving forward, but the rotation of the hinge and the slider won't stop at the exact same time. So I'm going to try that on frame 12. So you can see that stops, but the scope itself continues to move forward just a little bit based on the hinge rotation. That feels pretty snappy. And along with getting a little bit more overlap, I'm going to change the cover hinge as well. So let's take the first keyframe here and move that back. So I want it to look a little bit more as if it's being pulled forward by the momentum of the scope moving, rather than just all in sync with everything else. I think that looks a little more natural. And now we can look at the flaps. So this is probably the most fun part just because it's the most obvious or bombastic, but you can see that it clips through the sides right there as we move outwards. So we need it to get to at least, let's see, at least frame 3 before it starts to move. So let's take all of these different flaps, like so. I'll just box select them here and move them to frame 3. So it gets to the height at which it can clear everything and then starts to open up. I'm moving the scope hinge, the ending of it, to frame 13 here, just so that the scope cover hinge has a little bit of overlap, so this ends and that keeps going just a little bit. I think that looks a little bit better. I can also turn off overlays for a second just to see this a little bit more clearly. And I like the front flaps. I think those are looking pretty good. But the back one still seems a little bit odd to me for whatever reason. So I'm going to maybe take all of these last flaps. I think that's number 1. So I'll take all of the ones except number 1 and bring them forward just a little bit. Let's see, not that keyframe. Let's try bringing them to frame 13. And I think they should end a little bit after that. It still doesn't seem quite right. Let's do frame 14, and I'm going to try starting them a little bit later. Again, most of animation like this is just tweaking until it looks right. Let's try to get it going once that scope hits its like fastest part, more around frame 6-ish, or it really starts to get going. So it's as if the momentum is like pulling it forward instead of it just kind of happening on its own. That looks pretty good. It's like a little floppy, but it works. Now let's do the same thing for the back here. .001. So we need to make it a little bit more snappy. And also I think it should happen a little bit after the others, because it's being pulled up instead of pushed back. So let's try frame 8. And actually what we might do here is, instead of having it just stop right there, just give it a little bit of a bounce. So maybe it starts on frame 6 like everything else, but maybe it hits the end right around frame 13. Let's try this. Like so. And then I'm going to hit Shift D, duplicate the keyframe and move that back. And then on frame 14, I'm going to move it back even farther. So it just has a little bit of a bump or a bounce right at the end. Okay, and obviously that's way too much of like a flick. So let's try spacing this out a bit. So there's one keyframe of interpolation between it. So I think that works well. It's just too extreme. So let's walk that back a bit. But it can't go too far back, otherwise it's going to clip into the gun itself. So let's bring this back a little bit. Okay, this seems like it has a nice arc to it if you trace the path of the bone. It kind of pops up. Let's turn off overlays and look at it from a couple different angles. Okay, so that's super subtle, but I think it works. Now, we should have been looking at this the entire time, at least been paying more attention to the first-person view. And this is something that I was doing more when I was modeling, but I didn't really talk about it in terms of the rigging and animation. When we go to actually animate the character holding the gun in a later course, then we'll definitely be looking through the first-person view quite a bit. When we're doing this, we should also make sure that it looks and feels good from this view as well. And I think that it does. I think that we're on a pretty good path here. And now I think we can move on to the next section. Now that we've animated the rifle transform inside of an action here, I want to show you how to control this action using this bone on the side that we haven't animated yet. So what we actually need to do is first get rid of this action from our action editor here, because when we scrub through our timeline, this is what plays, and we don't want to be playing this animation anymore. We actually want to kind of put it away and hide it away and only use it within other animations, but not have it be the main one that's previewed here. So the way that we do that is actually just click Stash right here in the action editor, and you can see that it's now disappeared. Well, where is it gone? We can now switch in the editor type to the NLA editor, or nonlinear animation, and you'll see I have a few different stashes here. A couple from some test runs here with different weapons. I can unlock these, and I'll just go ahead and delete them. And I'll delete these stashes there. But we have this action stash.002, and it's unchecked, meaning it doesn't contribute to the animation, and it's locked, meaning that we can't move it around. So if you want to unlock it, you can do so. If you want it to actually contribute to what you're seeing in a 3D viewport, then you can hit that check mark, but by default, it's just turned off. If you want to go back and edit this animation, for whatever reason, you can hit Tab in the action editor, and you can see that you have some keyframes pop up, and then that's going to be what's editable in the dope sheet here, or the action editor. If we go to the dope sheet, then action editor, you can see that the rifle transform is now active. If we uncheck selected only, we have all of our keyframes here. But then when we hit Tab again, or exit out of that tweak mode, then we are no longer seeing those keyframes. And you can see that the action is no longer active in our action editor. So right now we actually don't need to be seeing this or previewing it, and it would actually make things a little bit harder for us. So I'm going to uncheck it and leave it locked as it was by default. So it's just kind of hidden away, but still saved for later use. So now we don't really need to be looking at our action editor anymore. I'll go ahead and collapse that. And now what we need to do is make all of these different bones that we animated work by just moving this little slider forward. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is find the limits of how far back and how far forwards this little slider should be. So I'll go to the Bone Constraints tab and add a Limit Location Constraint. Now we only want it to move along the y-axis, or its local y-axis. So let's choose minimum y and maximum y. And instead of world space, we need to choose pose space. Then we can also lock everything else. We don't want it to move on the X or the Z, and we can lock all of the rotations. I'll click For Transform as well in the Constraint tab so that it won't move past it as we move it. It looks like I should have chosen local space, not pose space. That's what I meant. But you can see that now it's just kind of stuck in place. So now I'm going to increase the maximum Y, and move this forward until it's right at the end of the slider there. Then if I hit N to pop open the sidebar, you can see that the Y location is now 0.112, and I'm going to just round that to 0.11. So if I set the maximum at I'll try just 0.1, and that's not quite far enough. So 0.11, that seems to work. So I'll leave that at 0.11. Now if we just hit G and move this, you can see that it kind of locks right in there. Can't move past that, or past 0 in the other direction. So now that we have these handy numbers, that's going to make it a little bit easier to guide the animation of these other things for that. Now to make sure everything's back where it should be, I'm going to select everything and hit Alt-G and Alt-R. And also if we go back to our dope sheet, and I actually did want our timeline still. So let me split my window here and switch this over to the timeline so I have these playheads. And also I can see that auto keyframing is still on, and I want to turn that off just so that I don't accidentally keyframe anything that I don't want to. But I'll hit Alt-G and Alt-R just to clear any transformations, such that everything is back to where it should be. Now for all of the bones that I want to move, which are all of the ones that we just previously animated in the transform action, I'm going to select them. First I'll just do this scope hinge, and then I'm going to add a bone constraint and choose action. Then I can choose the rifle armature and choose this bone. There's no eyedropper icon, but I can just choose scope transform, to action, rifle transform. And just as we just locked the rifle transform or the scope transform in Y location in local space, we need to set that here as well from target, Y location, and local space. And our action was 15 frames, so let's start on frame 1 and end on frame 15. And now as we move this forward, you can see that it starts to pop up. But remember that we had a maximum of 0.11, and so we need to set the minimum and maximum here, where the target range minimum is 0, that's perfect, but for maximum, let's type in 0.11. There we go. And now instead of snapping back and forth, it will smoothly transition. So this is perfect. Now we just need to copy this to all of the different bones that are also going to be animated. So to do that, I'm going to just manually select all of these different bones that I know need to be animated. I'll box select some of them, shift, select, let's see, this guy here, that one on the side, and these two for the scope. And then I'm going to put them on a second layer, a bone layer. So you can see that each bone under relations is on a particular layer. And if I hit M in the viewport, I can move it to a second layer, and you can see that they now disappear. But we can toggle between which layers we're viewing in the armature properties here. Under skeleton and layers, we can flip between these two. So it's really easy to only see one at a time, or you can shift and select both of them. However, this makes it really easy because now we don't need to see those bones as we animate this guy. Okay, so we have this second layer here, and I'm going to select everything and then select this main bone here, the one that we've already set the constraint to, and then making sure that that is the selected object, I'll go to Pose, Constraints, and copy constraints to selected bones. And there we go. Now all of these bones have the same constraint, and since they're all based on the exact same object, then it all just works. So if we head over back to our first bone layer here in the armature properties, I can move this back and forth, and everything works. So then to clean things up even farther, there's a few bones here that are necessary for that animation, but are never actually going to be animated. So for example, the scope itself, the scope cover, and this inverse kinematic chain right here at the front. If I just take those, and I can move them over to layer 3, and just hide them from view, that way we only need to worry about these bones here, but we can still animate the entire transformation. With that, we've wrapped up all the rigging that we need to do in order to get this into the hands of a character. That's a topic for another day though, so give yourself a pat on the back. You've made it to the end of another course. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you learned a lot along the way, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.